So welcome everybody. It's another edition of History Lunch Break here from the Greensboro History Museum. My name is Glenn Perkins, and I'm thrilled to have you guys spending your lunchtime with us, I hope, or maybe you're checking in on the show a little later from our recorded version. But no matter what you got in front of you, what's in your lunchbox, we're excited to have a chance to talk to you about some interesting history stuff. You know, ever since this year, right, we're all still trying to figure out what's happening with that, with the pandemic and the protests and the economic realities. The one thing that we do know, or the one thing that we do feel, is that we're all really living through history right now. And I think, and there's a lot of interesting projects that historians are doing, putting together in order to document this history, document it while it's happening. And today I have a lovely guest, Juilee Decker from Rochester Institute of Technology, where she teaches in the Museum Studies program, here to talk about one of those projects. Hey, Juilee.
Hey, Glenn, it's good to see you and nice
It's
to see everyone and be here. Thank you.
It's so great to be here. Now, you were involved in the project, A Journal of the Plague Year, which I found out about first, I guess, from a New York Times article back in the spring when we, as a Greensboro History Museum, were trying to figure out, you know, what could look like for us to connect with collections and stories and photographs and things like that of what was happening here in Greensboro. Can you tell us a little bit about the project, the Journal of Plague Year project, and how it got started?
Sure. So it's interesting the way the project came about. It really grew grassroots out of two Arizona State University faculty members, Catherine O'Donnell and Mark Thibault. And their idea was to bring together people who would be interested in both collecting experiences and what is going on right now, as well as people who would be interested in sharing their stories. So it's got the both parts. It's got the people like me who are working in public history, who are interested in helping to capture stories, and then individuals who would like a space to have their story preserved in some way. So the two of them sort of pitched out and said, who is interested in helping to bring this idea into a reality? And so a band of us, about pretty quickly it grew to a number of about 30 people, mostly academics, who were like, okay, this sounds like something that we can get behind and help to support. But I should say, although we have this sort of group that is helping to steer the ship and bring together the content, which I can go into in a second, we really are working with individuals across the United States. We are international, but the majority is from the US, and partners and museums such as Greensboro History Museum, because it's ways for us to bolster what people are doing and also bring content together so that people can see what the lived experience is like. And just in terms of numbers, so we started in March. Within about 2 months, we reached 5,000 contributions, which would be an individual submission, whether that's a photograph of us sitting around social distancing on our back patio, or someone's written narrative. So we grew to 5,000 items in 2 months. And now we're just over 7 months in. We have over 10,000 items. So it's pretty incredible, the breadth and depth of the contributions, and if that makes sort of any sort of temporal sense there.
So it got started, I guess, in early in the spring, sort of how long after?
Mid-March. It was it was mid-March. And the idea was that this collective group, which expanded quickly and now has more than 150 people sort of contributing in some way, that people could go online, and we're using a content management system called Omeka, and go online and deposit their story. And so with that sort of as the guiding spirit, we're using this model, which you all use at Greensboro too, and probably others in Guilford County as well, the model of shared authority, where you have this sort of framework that you're working in, but the person who's the contributor or the narrator of a story is helping to drive the ship. So everyone who is contributing in some way is co-creating what we're doing. So we have the platform, we have the interface, people can share their story, and then we, on the back end, we curate it and apply metadata and tags and stuff so it's findable and searchable, make sure the images are going to appear, and then it's available for people. So this idea of sharing authority, that it's not only one-sided of like an institution or a group of people, but it's both the people who are the framework and the sort of structure, as well as the person who's contributing. So we're sharing that authority, we're sharing the story making, and it's co-created that way.
Let me, I'm going to bring up the site so you can kind of
Oh, yeah,
point out
great.
some of the features of it. But while I'm doing that, do you want to tell a little bit about how you got involved in the project personally?
Sure, sure. So as I mentioned, it was March, and I'm friends with one of the originators, Mark Thibault. He and I are friends. We've been friends for a few years, and so I reached out to him, or we connected. I think I reached out to him, and I said, "I'm in. Just tell me what you need to do." So we were trying to think about, okay, so what should we be thinking towards? And my immediate concern in terms of my involvement was I had classes of students that I was teaching, like faculty everywhere. And, I thought, how am I going to bring my class along in this experience? And the courses I teach are museum studies and digital history kind of courses. And so all of my projects for my classes were not going to be able to be done anymore. That was just the bottom line. It was, the functionalities we have on campus are very different than once everyone dispersed to wherever they went for COVID. So my thinking was, I could maybe ask my students to contribute, and it would be voluntary and it would be an assignment, but they could do it. And if someone chose not to do it, I would have a different assignment for them. So each one of the students in my class called Visitor Engagement and Museum Technologies. So it's a class where we actually work on museum technologies and develop digital projects. Each one of my students contributed 5 entries. So they each and when I say an entry, it could be anything. It could be a photograph. It could be they were reading the news and saw a screen cap and made a screen cap of the Johns Hopkins website. It could be any submission. And they also had to critique the site. And it's definitely grown and improved since that time. So what you're showing right now is the much improved version of where we were in March. And they also had to kind of give an assessment of like, is this actually a good tool in terms of museums and historical archives as a digital tool? So that was my initial involvement. I mean, like everyone, I was just trying to get through COVID and and so I was involved in that front of like bringing along my students in that experience. And then my role shifted, and I've been working with museums and different institutions across the United States to help connect whatever they're doing during COVID with the Journal of the Plague Year site to sort of bring content from institutions to the site.
So let's see. Let me go back to the top here, and you can kind of give us a little tour about what the site is, how it works a little bit, and how folks can interact with it.
Okay, so on this main page here on the banner on the far left where it says share your story, if you scroll down a little bit, so that's the actual like where anyone can input a story and just go directly to the site. When I'm working with museum partners like with Greensboro or with Evansville, Indiana, the History Museum there, we are gathering things together to have them be part of a unit so that they are an exhibit unto their own. So people in Greensboro who are really interested in contributing, they can go online and just fill this out like any other person. But the idea is like when we're working with institutions that we can bring the content together and create an exhibit with that institution, with them in partnership. So the Share Your Story is where a lot of people start, and they will add or input their story there. When you go over 2 clicks there where it says browse the stories, Glenn, if you click on that page there enables you to actually go through and look at the entries that people have submitted and get to understand what people are interested in sharing as part of their story. And so that part is really a nice feature for just browsing and looking, and it defaults to date of entry. So the most recent ones are populated to the top, or the nearest ones that you would see. But you can also, in the upper right there in the search bar, if you put in baking or bread, or there was that banana bread phase for a while there, and then it shifted to sourdough bread and so forth, or masks or
Mm-hmm.
knitting or any of the search features. That's where you can kind of come up with a group of entries that relate to that. And that's done a dynamic search where it can be anywhere in the description. So when people write the description of it, or anywhere in the tags or the way that it's cataloged. The middle of the page there, the global pandemic map, shows where each of these entries is originating from. So I'm in Rochester, New York, but if I submit something about an experience my family is having, my brother lives in Pensacola, that would be mapped to Pensacola because
Mm-hmm.
that's where he actually lives. And then the other sort of facets there across the top toolbar are about some of the exhibits that have been gathered together, about calls that we're doing for particular stories. So when it was graduation season, we were really interested in hearing stories about, or reading stories about, and sharing them about graduation experiences. As we're moving towards the holiday, that's what our shift is going towards. COVID museums, so working with museums and institutions like yours is one of the calls. Yeah, so that kind of is the framework for the site itself. And I encourage people to look at it and to really kind of think about the experience of COVID now that we've had some time in it, but also a little bit of distance from it too.
Yeah, it's fascinating just to see the different experiences, and some of them are very familiar, whether it's, chalk drawings in a neighborhood or Easter eggs that people were putting in windows, and some of them is very different, and then using a lot of those news clipping, a lot of those digital sources is valuable too. You mentioned that the students were kind of evaluating or talking some about how they felt this was a tool that was a good tool for documenting their time. It sort of what's the consensus from them on that?
It was interesting. So they talked about their experience. It was interesting because they were also contributors to it. So they contributed first, and then they critiqued the site because they were then, they had actually used it, and then they were critiquing it both as a user and as a viewer. And there's two parts. One, it was fascinating to me because a lot of the students' commentaries and what they deposited on the archive were about feelings of fear, anxiety, loneliness, isolation, a lot of the things that we were all experiencing in March and April. And think about, students being taken from their environment on campus and then sent to wherever they might need to go, whether that was home or another place. And so they were extricated from this community that they were engaged with and then sent somewhere else or taken somewhere else. And so it was interesting because that was the feeling that came through most clearly. And then it was when the students were then going back and critiquing the site in the response papers, and this is a class of like 30 students. In the response papers, they were commenting on how when they were critiquing the site, they really felt the sense of connection, because a lot of what they were doing then is looking at stories, and they felt that they had something in common with someone else, someone they didn't know, but other people were feeling these same things. So on a personal level, I think it actually was quite therapeutic in some ways, and also reassuring, because they had that experience that they were using the site as a contributor and then as an evaluator. In terms of the site, the mechanics, and the technical side, the students, they were looking at a slightly earlier version than what we have now, but they really liked it. They thought it was great to be able to search and to see the mapping capabilities, to see where a lot of stories were emerging from. They liked the way in which a lot of the oral histories have transcripts. So they like that sort of ability to sort of have the dual functionality to listen and to also to read. So overall, the response was pretty positive. There were some students who had hoped that it might be a little bit more visually engaging, like visually appealing, more visually stimulating. But because we're dealing with a robust content management system using all different types of mediums, whether it's a TIFF file or a PNG file, or all these different technical file formats, we do have to pare down, I would say, on some things, but the functionality, I think, is actually much improved since what they saw. So I was grateful for their feedback. So
You mentioned that there are, thousands and thousands of entries now that have been shared as, you know, as you're encouraging classes to utilize it, as your colleagues are working with it, and again, as some institutions are working with it, and you're working with several different museums
yeah,
to kind of pull together collections that are really locally focused. So
yeah.
tell us a little bit about a couple of those projects.
Yeah, so one of the projects I've been working on is with the African American Museum of Nassau County. And so that's in Long Island, New York, which is quite far from where I am, just to put the geography out
Yeah.
there. There's not a hop, skip, and a jump. It's about 7.5 hours from where I am. So it's in Long Island. And I've been working with the director of the museum there. And we've been doing a couple of things. The main focus has been outreach to different groups in the community, and then those partnerships. So this institution happens to be kind of a cultural hub in this area, the area called Hempstead, New York. And so a lot of other organizations are associated or affiliated or partner with the museum. So doing outreach through that one hub to connect with other institutions and asking people to share their stories. So that's been the one facet. The other facet has been weekly recordings. So I record with members of the community every week. We do them on Thursdays. We have a little bit of a pause on it now because of the schedule with November, but weekly recordings where I interview someone about their COVID story. And we have 6 questions. We hop on Zoom. I record it. We do a transcript. And the range of those stories has been really fascinating to me. One of the most compelling ones, I recorded it in July, and it's on the, I'll put the little link, maybe it'll go in the chat, is a story of a woman named Janice Gilliard, who has used COVID as an opportunity to explore genealogy much more in depth than she would have otherwise. And the story, there's 3 parts to it. She recounts learning the story of her 5 times great grandmother named Willoughby McWhite, who was enslaved. And she talks about that entire experience of being able to spend a lot of time doing genealogy and how she was connecting the dots, or in the case of ancestry.com, connecting the leaves and uncovering this story. And it's a remarkable account, and it's only as a byproduct of COVID that she's been able to do that. And she also talks about family experiences and not being able to remember her mother's life because she passed during COVID, and sort of what that means. And so, it's one person's story, but I think there's crossover into so many other experiences that other people might be having about loss of life or about uncovering untold stories. So that's a particular one that, and there are other stories like that. So I record them regularly with members of the museum or friends of the museum, or somehow connected to the museum in some way. Another partnership has been with the Evansville Museum of History and Science, and they have been creating conversations online, and then they've recorded them with, it's called Cultural Insights. It's a series of people and how they're in the cultural sector, and what COVID is having as an impact on their life. And so the curator there, Tori Shendel Cox, has been interviewing people one-to-one and sort of discussing the impact of COVID in that space. And she's been interviewing folks from all over the US. And then she also with our colleague Tom Lonenberg, curated a show, and it's about collecting COVID. And so it's actually about COVID-19, its impact, and how their community, and Evansville, if you're not familiar, is sort of southeastern Indiana, off the Ohio River. So it's not on the river, but in that sort of nestled area there between Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana down there. And so this idea of curating a show, and it just opened recently about a month ago, on life during a pandemic. And so it's been interesting to sort of see. So that exhibit also has a place on our site. And so each of the items is curated as an item on the Journal of the Plague Year site. So it's, so, you know, like those are a couple of the examples of just sort of ways that communities are bringing their content to this larger framework.
That's so interesting. And if you're just popping in on our Facebook, we're talking to Juilee Decker about the Digital History Project, a Journal of the Plague Year. And if you guys have questions, you know, from our audience, who usually has very interesting questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box on Zoom. Or if I can use my peripheral vision, I can maybe see what's happening on the Facebook Live as well. So
you're a person of many talents, Glenn.
I know. I think it's interesting because you were just talking some about the woman who is inspired to look back at her own personal history and her family history because of the time and the way that COVID has sort of affected our sense of time. And you and I were talking about this even before we got started, that time just seems so weird now. Does it make history seem weird now? And is there a way that, you know, sort of working on a project like this as a way to connect those weirdnesses and show them and make use of them in real time?
You know, that's an interesting question. And when I think about this sense of history itself, I probably should have pointed out that, you know, our title, A Journal of the Plague Year, is borrowing from Daniel Defoe's novel about the plague in London. And it's this sort of account of the plague, and he's sort of writing with this historical distance. And so we're sort of riffing on that idea of, you know, history that isn't sort of is happening, and that it's this critical moment in how we record. And in terms of like, I think the historian's job, and I'm using historian like for all of us, I think the historian's job is to try to document as best as possible and to remember the human condition and the human connection. So when I go back and look at some of my students' entries, so they're all entered by their names and whoever submitted them, but they're collected under a tag that's my institution's name, Rochester Institute of Technology. So I can find them pretty quickly, find 100 and some of them that there are. And when I go back and look at those and I think of the particular student and I read sort of what they were feeling or what they observed at that particular moment, it reminds me that that was only 6 months ago or 7 months ago, and how far we seem to have come chronologically in terms of like the number of days, but also how if we didn't have this as a record, we might lose some of those nuances. So the whole idea of the craziness of toilet paper and not being able to go to the local store and buy toilet paper, we've definitely overcome that right now. But to explain to someone in a year, 10 years, 20 years, what that was like without a first person account would be challenging. And so I think it's been interesting to sort of see just that, how the historical distance has just slimmed down so much. And by the same token, the historical accounts that people are leaving, they're personal narratives that really will be, they are valuable now, and they will continue to be valuable in the future as people remember and reflect, and also take pride in the fact that we will overcome this. We don't know this right now, but we're hopeful and we're aspirational that we will. And of course, I would just say as a side note that there's this sort of concept of, they call it rapid response collecting, or collecting in crisis, collecting in times of crisis, is really, really valuable work. But it's work that also has effects. It is sometimes challenging to read these stories. And I'm sure you face this too, Glenn, in your work, and others too, that it's a burden to bear, to be inundated with stories of, in some cases, death, someone passing. They're not all, happy stories or moments that people have overcome something. And that comes from this tradition of, there's a hurricane digital memory bank that's an online collective of material. There's the September 11th digital archive. So this idea of archivists, public historians, curators, and communities bringing together and collecting stories as they unfold is definitely a 21st century phenomenon, and I'm grateful to be a part of it.
And I think it's so amazing that you can take all those voices and sort of group them together in a place in a way that you can see, I mean, if you're talking about the toilet paper, how different people across that map on all those different points of the map are feeling this. And there is something to that kind of population spread of these stories, I think, that an archive like this can achieve. Speaking of it from an archive point of view, our friend at UNCG Libraries, Aaron Larimore on Special Collections, wants to know a little bit about the sort of long-term preservation for the project. What you guys who are facilitating it are doing to make sure that the information is still available in 50 years.
Yep. So that's a great question. I love your question, Aaron. So part of the Omeka, we're using Omeka S as the name of the platform. And so the folks at Arizona State University, which is who started the instance, they have an endowment fund that is supporting the financial part of Omeka is free if you just get the regular standard Omeka, but there's an instance that we're using that requires a fee to have it and for support. And so part of what Mark started was this idea of, what's the sort of lifespan and sustainability. So he has a commitment from his institution for support. I believe it's for 10 years for that. And we are just turning, and I know that's not your 50-year question, we're just strategizing, and there may have been more recent developments on this, but we're strategizing in terms of the longer term preservation. I know that that's something that is important to Mark and to all of us on the team. And I think part of that is trying to think through the sustainability and what the sustainability and preservation practices that we put into place can still be sustained. But we are really grateful to Mark and to the folks at ASU who have stood up and said, this is important and our institutions support it. For institutions to put their content on the site, it doesn't cost anything, I mean, at all. And, all of the sort of labor that all of us are putting in, it's entirely volunteer labor. We do pay some interns to support the input and the cataloging. And so it's a really important project that has this very clear path for the next 10 years, and we're still working out the details for the rest. But I appreciate your question, and it's something that we are definitely trying to work through. And I will say, we have applied for some grants to sort of help us to get to that sort of next level in terms of long-term preservation, because we owe it as stewards of the collection. We owe it to those who have entrusted us with their stories.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously one of the challenges with rapid response is that you've got to start responding even maybe before you have that long-term plan. Then you have to kind of build that in parallel with, unless there's some sort of nice big overstructured archival system that is preparing itself to be ready for these, different kinds of rapid response things. So, which I'm sure Aaron could tell us about in detail. About the perspective, certainly from digital archives, which UNCG has got some amazing examples of. John Zachman, who's a curator here at the museum, was wanting to know a little bit about the US political context, and has that been a subject that's come up a lot in the archive?
So I think the political context has been interesting. So people submit, whatever their submissions are, we receive them all, and we don't censor or do
Mhm.
any of that. So it's interesting to see the range of perspectives and opinions, because in the very initial stages, a lot of the contributions were being sort of brought to the site through academics and organizations that were aware of it based upon the sort of spheres of influence of, like, Mark, I'm a friend of Mark, and then I got involved, etc. The perspectives really reflected, at the very immediate, and this is from my view of it, sort of academics and academic culture. But as soon as people reached out and then went beyond their networks, it grew, and so the perspective reflected then much more diverse.
Mhm.
But I will say that we noticed early on there were definitely some archival silences, and not so much in political context. I'll get to that in just a second, but just across the board, there were archival silences, like just communities who were not being represented. And so, as a team, the group has definitely tried to reach out and to connect with institutions and communities that haven't been represented so far. And a colleague of mine, Dr. Cheryl Jimenez Fry, who's at University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, she has her students doing oral histories, and her requirement for this fall, after seeing what the students had worked on in the spring, was that they have to interview someone who is not from what they consider their home community
Mhm.
group. This idea of, like, reaching beyond. In terms of the politics and the political context, immediately, and I'm saying this as someone who has a number of students who come from Asian countries, and so a number of those students reflected that in their submissions. It was very interesting to see the ways in which students of all nationalities were responding to the political climate in the United States, the wearing of the mask, the not wearing of the mask, and so how that impacted the complexion of some of the submissions. As I step back from my immediate group, there are reflections of across the political spectrum on the site, and it may not be overt, but in people's description or how they're defining something, it does sort of percolate through. And the what I find most interesting is the way in which people can put something on the archive, and then as historians or viewers, we can interpret it differently. And I think that's true with any first person account. You see the image, if there's an image applied to it, you read the text that has been self-defined, and we draw the conclusions from that based upon what we perceive and then what we sort of interpret ourselves, if that makes sense.
Mhm. And yeah, and I think that, just in terms of the big story of elections and the the, the national focus on this over the last few months, is that a sort of a collecting subset, or have you guys sort of tried to curate any pieces of that within the archive?
That I would say it's not necessarily a defined subset, although we do
Mhm.
have tags that reference the politics, the election, etc. What has been interesting is exactly what you just said, Glenn, that sort of the sort of COVID, and then these microcosms within that. So
Mhm.
definitely the election, definitely the political season, definitely the Black Lives Matter movement, definitely these sort of moments of protest and of resistance along this entire spectrum. So these are all not unrelated stories to COVID. I mean, COVID is the sort of moment that we're in, but there are all these other threads that are woven together into that story. And I think as a community, like we think about, each of us thinks about the past 7 months or 8 months and sort of what has transpired in our local communities, but then also a little bit, moving out from there, and then our national story and then the international stories. And it's fascinating to step back and realize all of these things are going on everywhere, and we have these ebbs and flows. And thinking about where Europe is right now in the COVID crisis, and what else is percolating under the surface that hopefully the archive can help to lift up and to elevate, and to make known in some way. So it's the COVID story, but it's all of those other threads of stories that really weave together the moments that we're in right now.
And a last question. So the focus of Journal of the Plague Year is actually on digital, solely on digital and resources, right? No
Yep.
effort to do any kind of artifacts or no physical stuff, because you guys are so spread out, right?
That's right. That's right. And I think that that's one of the so I would encourage people who are collecting objects to be in touch with us so that we can help give them a digital home, for others to see as well. But thankfully, I will say, as a curator, thankfully, I will say that that is not within our purview. And I think, as Aaron rightfully points out, there's a lot. People think, oh, it's digital, it's easy. Yeah. And it's not. Aaron's right. I mean, there's a lot of questions still to be solved. And my hope is that we can provide that space, and that place, so both digital and actualized, for people to seek and to find, and to hopefully help us all make sense of this moment that we're living in. So.
Well, I just want to say I'm so excited to be continuing to work with you on putting together a Greensboro kind of portal for the Journal of Plague Year. We've been pulling together some information, a lot of sources, and a lot of contributions to our History Happening Now initiative. And so we've got some great stuff, and it's just a matter of shaping it up in order to get it on the site. So
you all do. I mean, that's a teaser for your audience. That's a total teaser, because you guys I was looking through some of the materials that you all have. I mean, just the picture of a strawberry market out in front of the hospital. I mean, people social distancing and having their happy hour. Someone who came up with a badge plan of like how to have merit badges to get through certain things during COVID. I mean, you all have really risen to the challenge of both getting through COVID and forging a community. So kudos to you all. I'm really grateful for connecting with you and opportunity to share your stories.
Well, thanks so much, Julie. I know you and I are going to be in touch as we go along, but I do appreciate you taking some time to sit and chat with us on the lunch break here.
Thanks so much.
And